So, it's finally here, huh? The game everyone has been waiting for so long from the moment they realized it was in development. I'm of course talking about Bannerlord, not Resident Evil 3. It wasn't a long wait for Resident Evil 3 at all. It was only like a year, barely a year. I need to check out what the release date of the Resident Evil 2 remake was, but it wasn't very long ago when it was released. But boy oh boy, this release is shaping up to be a lot more interesting than the Resident Evil 2 release. Now make no mistake, Resident Evil 2 was a great game, I think it was a great game, and when it was released, it got unanimously good, great, excellent critical reception. Everybody loved it. I mean, a few people might have problems with it. No game is ever going to please everybody, but the critical reception in general was very, very good. This time around though, while the average score, if you go on places like Metacritic, are still quite reasonably high, the actual reception, if you go and look into each review individually, is a lot more divisive, with some places going as low as a 6 out of 10, which is quite a sharp drop from Resident Evil 2. But does Resident Evil 3 deserve it? Of course, that all depends on your own subjective opinion, the subjective opinion of everybody who plays this game, and I'm glad to share my subjective opinion, but not before mentioning that critical reception stuff. And also I want to mention how hilarious it is that Resident Evil 3's development schedule kind of mirror the original Resident Evil 3's. I mean, the remake schedule matches the original schedule, because in case you didn't know, the original Resident Evil 3 was never meant to be Resident Evil 3. It was meant to be a smaller, shorter, more experimental game, until Capcom was like, no, PlayStation 2 is going to get released, the Resident Evil brand is not going to hold, please make this more experimental title into a traditional Resident Evil game and release it real quick. By the way, we are cutting 2 months off the development time, and yeah, just do it. That's basically what Capcom said to Mikami, and he was so mad that he almost quit Capcom at the time. But he didn't, and we got Resident Evil 3, a rushed, really short game that reused a lot of the assets from Resident Evil 2. So yeah, the new one, unfortunately, it also feels very rushed, and it was also released just 1 year later, and yes, it also reuses quite a few assets from Resident Evil 2. The situation mirrors almost perfectly, honestly, except for the fact that instead of mercenaries, this time around we got Project Resistance, which Capcom really wants you to know that you are going to get separately whenever you buy Resident Evil 3 Remake, and that they really want you to play it. But I won't touch on Project Resistance right now. I don't know if I will ever touch upon Project Resistance, because I'm honestly not that interested in Project Resistance. I'm interested in the main game and what they have done with it. So, let's get right into things. What is Resident Evil 3? Well, Resident Evil 3 Remake is a prequel, but also a sequel, except not really, more of a interquel, I think it's called, of Resident Evil 2. The Resident Evil 3 game takes place in Raccoon City, and it starts before the events of Resident Evil 2, but it ends roughly at the same time as the events of Resident Evil 2. So you get to see the entire, oh, Raccoon City got infected by zombies event from a different perspective. The perspective of Jill Valentine, one of the main protagonists of the very first Resident Evil game. And Jill has her work cut out for her, because just like in Resident Evil 2, she's going to have to do some real third-person survivor horror bullshit this time around as well. She's going to have to deal with ammo management and inventory management and health management, as well as going back and forth through dangerous environments as she tries to unlock new ways for her to proceed. Only she has even less luck than Claire and Leon ever had, since unlike Claire and Leon that were being chased by Mr. X, this time around she's being chased by Nemesis, which is basically Mr. X on steroids, like Mr. X with rocket launchers and flamethrowers and super attacks with tentacles that he can use to drag you from across the screen. Just some real crazy shit all around this time. But I'm going to stop just for a few seconds for a controversial opinion moment and say that the original Resident Evil 3 was always short and rushed compared to the original Resident Evil 2, and the only reason a lot of people remember Resident Evil 3 more fondly is because of this guy. And Capcom went in hard on this. The very moment you start the game, well, the first moment you start the game, you just go to a setup screen and the game immediately begins with a very interesting narrative sequence. But every time afterwards, when you have to go through the main menu screen is just Nemesis looking down on you from you looking at Nemesis from a very low camera angle. I guess it depends on your opinion. And it's very clear that Capcom knows and is banking on the fact that, hey, this is the game Nemesis begin, because Nemesis is like one of the most iconic, yes, I'm using this word correctly this time for once, he's definitely one of the most iconic enemies in video games of all time. Even if you don't know, even if you didn't play Resident Evil, if you saw like say a 3D render of the original Nemesis design, you definitely know that that was Nemesis. And Nemesis is in this game quite a lot. In fact, he is in from the very first 5 minutes of the game, but not exactly in the organic Mr. X way you're probably thinking of. Explaining what Nemesis' role in this remake is and what this remake aimed for and what exactly is going on with all the reviews is going to take some in-depth explanation, so allow me to try to summarize my experience as best as possible. When you are starting the game, it doesn't feel like it's going to be a linear action-focused experience. I mean, the developers and the directors themselves said it was going to be a lot more linear and action-oriented, but it doesn't feel that way at first because the city streets where you begin, they are open, but they are also filled with nooks and crannies for you to explore, and all sorts of interconnectedness. Like the police station, it's nowhere near the level of interconnectedness and real place feeling of the police station from 2, but it's close enough that you think, oh, it's Resident Evil 2, but I'm on the city streets. And shortly after the beginning, you also go through a maze-like place, and shortly after that, you get to solve a puzzle. So at the beginning, everything feels very, this is a logical step forward from Resident Evil 2, but that is going to change quickly as soon as you're out of the city streets, because the city streets being open and interconnected and stuff makes it the only place where Nemesis is chasing you organically, the only place where he can appear anytime after his first introductory scene, and that he can attack and that you have to deal with him and going back and forth and solving puzzles and the zombies at the same time. That gives you that Resident Evil 2 being chased by Mr. X while trying to do the normal procedures, the normal path of the game kind of stuff. And after you do that, after you exit the city streets into the sewers, which is the second part, everything starts feeling a lot more linear. There are no more puzzles, except for some very simple traversal ones. In fact, a lot of the difficulties in the environment is sort of Metroidvania-like. Get an item in order to unlock a door or unlock a box that has an item that you need to proceed kind of thing. And not really puzzle-like or anything. There is some brain power involved in order for you to, do the regular inventory management, as well as remembering how to traverse, where to go when you unlock certain items and go. But it's basically go there, get item A so you can go back to door B that you passed long ago and unlock it with the item in order to proceed. And the environments themselves kinda don't really encourage all that much backtracking. I mean, there are a few segments in the beginning and the very end that encourage that sort of exploration and non-linear path going, but there's like this whole chunk in the middle of the game where it's just linear. It's just incredibly linear, and you just go from point A to point B, from point A to point B, from point A to point B, and you just maybe backtrack a room or two, and it doesn't really feel Resident Evil interconnected. It feels like a linear series of levels with a few nooks and extra crannies to explore. It doesn't really feel like a map that you're going to slowly explore and unlock. And you do get to a few places later in late game where you do have to do some non-linear exploration, and you get one puzzle before the end of the game. And that's kind of hilarious because the original Resident Evil 2 Remake captured the puzzles without being too overbearing with them so perfectly. And this one just has one very easy puzzle at the beginning and one very easy puzzle at the end. Almost as if they were just folding it in and being all like, yeah, okay, we are going to just put some puzzles because of Resident Evil, it has to have some puzzles somewhere. On the opposite end of the spectrum of is Resident Evil, so you have to put it in, but in this case showing up constantly, it's Nemesis. Of course, he doesn't show up with now its own share of problems. The main problem, in my opinion, being that, well, he shows up naturally, organically is a better word. He only shows up organically, like in a gameplay mechanic sense of kind of way, at the very beginning of the game. Once you fight and finish his first boss battle, he keeps showing up constantly throughout the game, but only in scripted chase sequences and boss battles. The moment you see, I liked his boss battles. I honestly really enjoyed his boss battles, and some of them have quite a few cool little gimmicks to spice up the battle. And the final encounter with him is just absolutely spectacular. I'm not going to spoil anything, but from a narrative sense and from a sense of pure, is Nemesis cool? Nemesis is very cool. Nemesis fights are very cool, but it's disappointing that he isn't a gameplay mechanic. He just show up in these scripted linear ways after the beginning of the game. That was a bit of a disappointment, but hey, at least he's still cool, and they didn't end up accidentally cutting him out somehow. They cut a few things, of course, whether it's cutting or putting two things together into one, or actually a remix, it's up to you, since the original Resident Evil 2 also changed things up. But in this one, it feels kind of weird. Like, for example, they cut the clock tower, but you actually do get to have a fight with Nemesis outside the clock tower, and then nothing. There is no inside of the clock tower or anything, you just kind of skip to the next part, which is what, it's not only the clock tower, but a lot of other of these details of places. There are a few panels that you look at it and you're like, oh, this is going to be a puzzle, and then it isn't. It reeks of rushedness. It reeks of them rushing the game out of the door, because I have no idea why they rushed the game out of the door. They could have even done a release like, oh, we're going to release this 1 year later, like Resident Evil 3 to Resident Evil 2, but they could have easily done the release in like October, and I think they could have probably added quite a few more things in puzzles, and people would have loved them, and the game would have felt more complete with them. The game is short, but the original Resident Evil 3 was also short. Resident Evil games are short games, though I do like backtracking a lot in order to go to the item boxes and place every single item that I find inside of them. So if you were to take a look at my save file, it actually took close to like 7 hours for me to finish the game. I mean, the game does say you have 5 hours of playtime, but 7 hours of total playtime. That's because I imagine it's not counting the cutscenes, so is that like 2 hours of cutscenes? Maybe. I didn't personally count every single second of the cutscenes, of which there are quite a few. But, yeah, it is a short game. And it is a game that feels rushed, and it feels like it doesn't have content, it doesn't have the puzzles, it doesn't have the encounters. What it does have, I believe, compared to Resident Evil 2 Remake, is a great enemy variety. It has a lot of enemy variety, and the game is so short that every single time you're like introduced to an enemy, it isn't going to take long before you're introduced to another enemy, and it just feels like a constant circus of freaks, I guess, mutant freaks going at you, and it's excellent. And they actually introduced quite a few of the enemies in, you know, the Resident Evil way. That makes you wonder, oh man, how is that thing going to fuck me up this time? And yeah, in terms of enemy variety, I have no complaints. And the game actually has quite a lot of spooky moments where corpses drop from the ceiling, and quite a few cheeky fuck you from the devs, like when you're in a corridor and suddenly a motherfucking giant monster shows up and you're like, ah shit, I gotta go back, but then the devs actually spawn 3 zombies back, so you actually have no escape. If you try to go back, you're going to trigger the zombie activation cutscene, and if you go forward, the creature might very well one-hit kill you. There's quite a lot of things in this game that can one-hit kill you. Sometimes I got killed in one hit by a creature, and then I went and fought it, and then it didn't the second time, and I don't know if that has to do with the adaptive difficulty that these games have, apparently, that people have confirmed that the game gets harder the better you play or easier the worse you play. I can't confirm if it has something to do with that. Some one-hit kills seemingly triggered it at random, and you know, yeah, it kind of reminds me of old school design to just have monsters one-hit kill you. You don't see that much often these days, and it's kind of funny that I actually sort of just laughed and kind of missed that, considering how originally I thought how frustrating it was to be one-hit killed. But due to the overabundance of save rooms in this game, you never lose too much progress when you die. So making the enemies a proper trap, yeah, I think that was a good move on Capcom's side. So yeah, good enemy variety, good enemy encounters, good spooky stuff, and tense moments. It's just incredibly linear compared to the original games. And you do get to play as Carlos for a few segments this time around, instead of having like two. The original Resident Evil 3 only had one campaign, and this one tries to follow the same formula, unlike Resident Evil 2, who had 2 campaigns. So you know, you just see everything in one go, which makes it quite a bit shorter in terms of content, and there is no New Game Plus, there is no branching paths. There is, after you finish the game, you unlock a shop in which you can use points you get by completing the in-game challenges, which are the achievements basically. You get points and you can go in the shop and buy like an infinite ammo machine gun, so you can carry a machine gun with infinite ammo on your next playthrough. And what can I say? That is very bare bones extra content. I imagine Capcom went full in with Project Resistance, and that they expect Project Resistance to be the extra game modes, but considering the updates that the original Resident Evil 2 released with the Ghost Survivors, free DLC and everything, I hope that they are not just going to rush to Resident Evil 8 or to whatever they want to do next. I hope that they don't focus solely on Project Resistance. It has already been confirmed that 17 April, I think, Jill is going to be released as a survivor for Project Resistance. But I hope that they actually update this game. This game is in dire need of content. It's a good game. I'm gonna go straight ahead and say to you that Resident Evil 3 is a good game. I enjoyed it, but it's definitely not, if you're more casual than I am relating to video games, if you don't want to play the latest releases and have the disposable income to do that, don't buy it now. It's not worth $60. Project Resistance is a multiplayer game. It's going to have countless hours. If you want that, maybe it's worth it, but if you're here for the single player experience, it feels incredibly short. And I do prefer quality over quantity. God, that was quite a slip. But I do prefer quality over quantity. There is nothing I hate more than playing a game with lots of meaningless padding that just wastes your time, and Resident Evil 3 doesn't waste your time. But here's the thing, it's not like it just doesn't waste your time, it actually feels like there are pieces of the puzzle that are missing. It doesn't feel like, let's say, a padded game is a game with too much meat on the bones, and Resident Evil 3 is not a game with the right amount of meat in the bones. It's a skeleton. There is no meat. There's almost no meat on these bones. And that's why, based on sheer length alone, I mean, maybe you want to be like, oh, I'll just replay the same thing 10 times over, even if there is no new game plus or variations. So who knows what kind of variations they could put with levels this linear and so few puzzles they can't even remix the puzzles like in Resident Evil 2 Second Route. But if you're worried about length, yeah, it's a very short game, and I personally can't recommend it at $60, maybe $30, maybe even less. But maybe wait for a sale for this one. And let's go back a few sentences when I was talking about enemy types and enemy encounters. I found that killing zombies this time around, there are a lot more zombies. So killing them actually I found it easier than in Resident Evil 2. The critical hit you randomly get when you shoot a zombie and his head just explodes, I felt it triggered a lot more often, probably to compensate for the higher number of zombies. But a part of me was kind of disappointed that I can't just dodge them so much to conserve ammunition. A lot of times zombies will be in corridors that are just too tight for you to pass through on the linear levels, and on the non-linear segments the corridors are also tight and they might have a little bit of wiggle room, but you're better off just killing them because you know you're going to go to that corridor again and it's just going to be a nightmare to not get killed the second time through. So it actually felt like the game just wanted me to unload my ammunition on the zombies. That was just the only option available a lot of the time. And I'm a more classic survival horror fan. I dodged and I left a lot of zombies alive in the Resident Evil 2 remake that I just couldn't. And not just zombies, but other type of enemies. And on that topic, I also want to get philosophical and leave you a question in your mind as we reach the end of this review. What is Resident Evil? Because that sounds incredibly weird, but seriously, what makes a Resident Evil game a Resident Evil game? Because this game has almost zero puzzles, and whenever I hear people talking about them, whenever I mention them to one of the people I know, people were like, "What? That's crazy, it ain't Resident Evil if it doesn't have puzzles." But it does have the tension and stuff. It just doesn't have the tension of having to go through the same places and the fear that the places might now be infected with new enemies or stuff, but you do still get the spooks. So is it the spooks? Is linear spooks Resident Evil? Can linear spooks be Resident Evil? Is interconnectedness Resident Evil? Are enemy types Resident Evil? Is Nemesis Resident Evil? I don't know anymore. I enjoyed this game. It is a quality game, and I think a lot of people are going to enjoy it, even if it's quite short. I think quite a lot of people are going to enjoy it. I think that saying it's like a gigantic step down from Resident Evil 2 in terms of the main gameplay loop of management and combat is dumb, but what if you aren't the kind of person who wanted to, no, it's not dumb. Actually, let me just verbally backspace a little bit and say that's just your personal opinion, because really, what if you're the kind of person who wanted the puzzles? What if the zombies are just a way to heighten the tension of solving the puzzles and exploring this threatening world, having to be careful going through it? What if zombies and linear action isn't what you want from Resident Evil? But does that mean that people who want more linear spooks and stuff aren't true Resident Evil fans? Are the puzzles what makes Resident Evil? Is removing the puzzles removing a core part of the experience of Resident Evil? Is removing the interconnectedness? Because really, I'm more mad about the lack of interconnectedness than the puzzle. And there are two segments of the game that are highly interconnected, not as highly as the police station, but still quite interconnected and take quite a few backtracking, and it actually feels like you're exploring a place. And I think that's why I'm more appeased by this remake, because they didn't just completely remove everything, but it is quite a chunk more linear. There are only two puzzles, and if actionized, I won't say it is a more action-focused sequel. It just doesn't feel like that because it plays exactly like Resident Evil 2. You still are slow, you still shoot at the same rate, you still have access to the same weapons. So it doesn't really feel like it was actionized when you're actually playing the game, even though it was actionized because the feel of the second game doesn't. And I'm just confused, and I'm just saying bullshit over and over again. I'm just asking this question that I cannot answer to you, for you to say to me, what do you think Resident Evil is? Is it the ridiculous plot lines and umbrella and characters constantly getting thrown into horrible situations over and over and over again, and nobody fucking stopping corporations from showing up and creating this disgusting, absolutely unethical, experimental biological weapons over and over again? Is the story, is the complication, is reading notes Resident Evil? There are lots of notes to read in this game that talk a lot about the lore and how people felt as the zombie invasion started Raccoon City. Is that Resident Evil? I don't know. I don't know where Resident Evil is anymore. When I played Resident Evil 2, the remake, I pointed at that and I was like, yeah, that's third person. I'm more of the fixed camera guy when it comes to survival horror, and I think fixed cameras are actually an underrated camera scheme that are not objectively bad, as people say, but that's a whole other topic for a whole other video. But even without the tank controls or the fixed camera angles, when I played Resident Evil 2, I found it that the story was reasonably good, that the game was fantastic, that the lore notes were good, that out of that, cool, the police station actually has a bunch of hidden mechanisms and you have to use different kinds of cards, keys. It's not card keys, you know what I'm talking about. Talk about the diamond, the heart keys and stuff, and you can find some keys with some characters, but you could with others and explore rooms that perhaps you didn't explore in your first playthrough, and you solve a bunch of puzzles. Oh, and the examine function actually served a purpose in solving puzzles in Resident Evil 3. Here, it shows up, but all you do is have to examine an object to, like, examine a box to unlock it. It really feels like they really phoned it in and just put it there, some items to examine, because Resident Evil 2 Remake had some items to examine. Another aspect of the game that I feel presents it was rushed. But anyway, when I played Resident Evil 2, I felt like I was playing a Resident Evil 2 game. When I played Resident Evil 3, I felt like I didn't know what Resident Evil was about anymore. And I think that's a sufficiently bizarre takeaway for the end of this video. Yeah, I think this is the place where I want to end this, and the question I want to leave it with you. What is Resident Evil? Because depending on how you answer that question, what do you want from Resident Evil, that's going to be your answer on whether Resident Evil 3 is for you or not. So yeah, that's my final verdict. Is Resident Evil for you spooks and inventory management and dodging and having to make sure every shot counts because your ammo isn't infinite? Yeah, Resident Evil 3 Remake is for you. Is Resident Evil for you puzzles and interconnectedness and the feeling that you're exploring an actual, real, dangerous but kind of slightly wacky road? Yeah, you might want to hold off on this one for a while. Anyway, thanks for reaching the end of this incredibly ranty review video, and like and subscribe if you feel like it, or dislike it if you think this was a bad take. It's your opinion, man, and we live in a free world. I hope you live in a free country. If you don't, I'm rooting for you. Go to a free country and then properly like and dislike the videos as you feel like it. Yeah, that's a proper ending to a video. That's how you end a review.